Welcome back to Systematic Theology. This is Unit 5, where we're going to be continuing our discussion on special revelation. This week in particular, we want to talk about the doctrine of Scripture, about its authority, its inspiration, its inerrancy, and its infallibility. Now, these terms are often debated and terms that can be sort of confusing if you don't have a way into them. So this is a pretty important unit to be reading closely and paying attention to some of the categories that people like Erickson are presenting when they're distinguishing between absolute inerrancy, full inerrancy, and the various forms of limited inerrancy. Of course, this is a topic that is of great value to our own Southern Baptist tradition and heritage, one that was a very debated topic in the event that we call the conservative resurgence. So these are issues that I think are pretty crucial for us to discuss and be able to read about and be well informed about. The doctrine of inspiration comes in a couple of different forms. When we talk about the dictation theory of inspiration, what we would call a dynamic theory of inspiration, and some other looser forms of inspiration which make the biblical text something simply like a work of art, like a play from Shakespeare. But the position that most evangelicals embrace, the position that I myself embrace, is what we call plenary verbal inspiration. And plenary verbal inspiration is not something that tells us about the particular method by which God inspired Scripture. It simply says that every word of Scripture is inspired, that God providentially has worked in and through human personalities, human situations, to produce the exact result that He wants us to have. It's not something as mechanical as dictation theory. It's something that preserves for us the unique personalities of authors, the unique writing styles of different authors, the unique situations and theological interests of the human authors. That's why you would have different personalities and different writing styles coming out, say, across the 4 different Gospels. It's why Peter talks about Paul's letters being hard to understand, because there's human elements at work in the inspiration of these texts. Inerrancy basically means that whatever God has inspired is trustworthy and true. So if we argue that all of Scripture is inspired by God, we want to say that all of Scripture is trustworthy and true in what it intends to communicate. That's not to say that Scripture doesn't bear witness to some things that aren't true, like some of the bad theology that Job's friends had. Job's friends probably would have qualified for a program on TBN. They were the first prosperity gospel theologians. We have people who make erroneous statements all the time in Scripture, but Scripture does not affirm those things. Those are usually the things that come out of the mouths of people who are not speaking on behalf of God. So what we want to say in inerrancy, bottom line, is everything that the authors of Scripture affirm to be true is true. Scripture is true in terms of its propositional content, but it is also trustworthy because the authors of Scripture, both human and divine, are trustworthy. We can trust what they say. They have a characteristic of veracity, of truth-telling, that we can subscribe to, that we can trust that these are the words that God has for us. So those are 2 of the big issues that we'll be addressing. We'll also be talking about authority and the issue of the supremacy of Scripture, sola scriptura, as the term the Reformers classically used, that there's no other source that is important for the theological enterprise, for understanding and knowing God than Scripture. Scripture is the primary way that God reveals Himself and relates Himself to us. So all of these things will be discussed in this unit. What you'll want to do is you'll want to read the assigned readings from Erickson, from Grudem, and Allison. There is a reading quiz, and there is a discussion board question. And the discussion board question basically goes like this. There are skeptics and non-evangelicals of every kind who are atheistic, agnostic, or religious or not religious. And they often challenge the doctrine of biblical inerrancy as something that is irrelevant, something that's patently false. And here I want you to discuss in this discussion question how you would talk about inerrancy to a skeptic or a non-evangelical Christian who would challenge you on this particular doctrine. And for skeptics and agnostics, I want to ask the simple question, is adherence to biblical inerrancy necessary for Christian belief? Do you need to affirm inerrancy to become a Christian? Yes or no? I want you to think about that. And for non-evangelical Christians, I want you to ask the question, how does one's view of inerrancy or authority shape one's doctrine, one's practice, and one's ministry? How does it relate to your ethics, your worldview about sexual practices, about abortion, so on and so forth? I mean, these are important questions that I think a robust view of inerrancy can help address.